In common usage, connotation is taken to mean something secondary, added on, or incidental to language. Its primary definition in the Oxford English Dictionary is the signifying in addition, inclusion of something in the meaning of a word besides what it primarily denotes, implication. According to this view, language is for the most part a neatly organized set of simple one-to-one correspondences in which each phonetic or graphic signifier denotes a signified out in the world. Conceived in this way, it is not essentially different from the signalic behaviors of animals or the codes used to facilitate human-machine interactions, or things like alarm clocks or stop signs for that matter. Denotation is thought of as nothing really much more than signification, and the task of language is reduced to a sort of pointing. If we can just get our observations and our labels for them to be more accurate, human knowledge will surely advance. But as Susan Langer and others have argued, this ignores the question of meaning. Signification in itself provides nothing that would account for a vast range of phenomena that are characteristic of human mentality, consciousness, and culture. Symbolization is not as parsimonious, practical, and efficient as simple signification. What's more, it thrives especially when unconstrained by a semiotic code, as in the cases of art, ritual, and dream. Indeed, Langer's archetypal exemplar of the properties of symbolization is to be found in individual perception. Sense data themselves are symbolic in that they formulate and conceptualize, as opposed to merely signifying experience. Apart from and prior to any socially constructed and shared code, she asserts the existence of an innate human need of symbolization that is unrelated to any act of signification. Even in the case of language, she maintains that a concept is all that a symbol really conveys. The transformation of experience into concepts, not the elaboration of signals and symptoms, is the motive of language. Speech is through and through symbolic, only sometimes signific. Langer believed that our modern technological society has created an intellectual atmosphere in which signification has come to be more highly esteemed than symbolization, and signals have come to replace symbols, or at least symbols are treated more and more like signals for their significative function. The broad cultural consequences of this include our modern obsession with technology and the collapse of a shared system of human values. The pointing function of language increasingly causes us to miss what lies between the facts, as she calls it, since unlike connotative meaning, which is capable of indefinite growth, the significations of a code are always finite. And although in a living language no word is a purely conventional counter, but always a symbol with metaphysical pathos, the normal person only really reads the labels, as it were, on the objects around him and troubles no further. What she calls abbreviated symbols cloak things in a cap of invisibility. And yet, although she takes pains to distinguish and even to oppose symbolization and signification, sign against symbol, throughout the bulk of Philosophy in a New Key, when it comes to language, Langer seems to feel compelled to accommodate symbolization to a code structure. Insisting that it is more than mere signification, she explains the complex affair of denotation thus. S, or the signifier, is coupled for a certain subject with a conception that fits O, or the object, that is, with a notion that O satisfies. But such coupling says nothing about how the concept was formulated, let alone how it came to be judged satisfactory for such matching. Her insertion of the phrase, for a certain subject, suggests that this coupling is an act. Perhaps by a certain subject would make this clearer. But that this act would be one of merely coupling two substantives, a symbol and a conception, reduces it to something similar to the significations of a code. Both connotation, her name for this coupling, and denotation, or the coupling of this coupling with an object, are portrayed as consisting of code-like significations. So then, where is meaning to be found? Without its associated conception, What she calls the symbol is in fact nothing more than a signalic signifier with a signified object, and where to find conception. Signs, as signs, only signify other signs, which leads to an infinite regress. This is what is meant by portentous statements about language and other semiotic codes only referring to or meaning themselves. Rather than treating conception as a substantive in order to meet the requirements of a semiotic code, perhaps it is better to think of the act of formulating conceptions or symbolizing as meaningful. Perhaps it is not symbolic representations themselves or any sort of substantive for that matter, but what we do with them that is meaningful. In characterizing symbolization as a constructive activity of mind that is inherent in perception itself, Langer rightly stresses this psychological aspect of meaning. But in her all too common efforts to account for the logic of meaning as a function of the form of signs, I believe that two things tend to be ignored. One, while the constituent elements of presentational forms are infinite in number, variety, and combinability as lived experience itself, those of a discursive code are finite and relatively fixed. Two, though the forms of the signifiers of a discursive code might also be used in symbolization, this symbolization is external to the code. The phonemes of a spoken language, for example, may be used to achieve poetic effects, but the coded denotations of the words they are used to signify are the same as their written counterparts. Like the great variety of other symbolic uses of language, its coded significations provide not meanings, but elements out of which meanings are constructed. The motivation of these linguistic significations are themselves external to the code. So although denotation consists of the pairing of a concept with an object by means of a linguistic sign, the formulation of the concept is external and prior to its signification in the code. The patterned elements of presentational forms are analogous to those of perceptions, which, as meaningful formulations of experience, are the products of symbolific activity. Both are used to generate and provide conceptual meanings that can be signified by a code, but they themselves do not belong to or constitute a semiotic code. The signs and significant pairs of a semiotic code, on the other hand, can be used to form symbolic representations in a great variety of ways, but outside of the code. All of this seems to argue in favor of seeing symbolization and signification as two separate and quite different phenomena. Just this conclusion is reached by anthropologist and cognitive scientist Dan Sperber in his potent little book, Rethinking Symbolism. Tacit knowledge, he tells us, which is the primary concern of the anthropologist and that upon which all explicit knowledge rests, cannot be learned by rote. It must be reconstructed in each individual, making it direct evidence of specific learning abilities of a qualitatively determined creative competence. He argues that symbolic interpretation is not a matter of decoding, but an improvisation that rests on an implicit knowledge and obeys unconscious rules. As a cognitive mechanism, symbolism is an autonomous mechanism that, alongside the perceptual and conceptual mechanisms, participates in the construction of knowledge and in the functioning of memory. Like Langer, he differs from semiological views, which see symbolism primarily as a means of social communication. It is an instrument of thought before it can be an instrument of communication. So, like Langer, he suggests that the basic principles of the symbolic mechanism are not induced from experience, but are, on the contrary, part of the innate mental equipment that makes experience possible. Unlike any code, it can turn noise into information. Unlike language, which uses categories to talk about the world, symbolism uses sense data, signs, and even linguistic statements about the world to establish relations between categories. Frequently unpaired with signified meanings, symbol systems function quite well without exegetic commentary. Rather, Sperber asserts that a representation is symbolic precisely to the extent that it is not entirely explicable, that is to say, expressible by semantic means. Semiological views are therefore not merely inadequate, they hide from the outset the defining features of symbolism, as shown by their inability to account for those symbolic phenomena which bypass all forms of coded communication and set up direct links between nature observed and the inward state of the observer. Symbolism does not encode information, it organizes it. As Sperber explains, it is not a question of interpreting symbolic phenomena by means of a context, but one more page, okay. But quite the contrary, of interpreting the context by means of the symbolic phenomena. Like Langer, he uses the metaphor of a light source. Symbolic elements organize the mental representation of systems of which they are parts. It is this act of organization, what Langer would call formulation, as opposed to any of its elements, that is meaningful. This point is amply illustrated by Langer's explanation of how the basic perception of images is symbolic. The perception of symbolic value begins with the sense that a departure from the norm is significant in some way. What Sperber calls the conceptual mechanism fails in forming a completed concept that can be passed into passive memory. This failed conceptual representation becomes the object of a second representation made by the symbolic mechanism, which attempts in bricoleur fashion to find its relevance, to focus on what seems incomplete in the pattern of associations, and to evoke information in passive memory that might complete it. Information that escaped the conceptual mechanism is submitted to it. This would seem to support Langer's assertion by explaining how it is that we can look at them instead of through these familiar signs and abbreviated symbols through which the normal person really only reads the labels, as it were. A seemingly significant disturbance or anomaly in the routine exigencies of ever-passing significant experience triggers a search to construct new meaning. Compare this to Thomas Kuhn's argument about how crisis in normal science leads to paradigm shift. Symbolization, according to Sperber, consists of two parts: a focalization on the unfulfilled conceptual conditions and an evocation of information in passive memory that might fulfill those conditions. When those conditions are met, the concept can be passed back to the conceptual mechanism and either stored in memory or signified by a code. Thus, the input of the symbolic mechanism is the defective output of the conceptual mechanism, and the output of the symbolic mechanism is the input of the conceptual mechanism. In this scheme, symbols that denote meanings are replaced with acts of meaningful evocation. Rather than a static, finite code, it envisions a symbolism that is infinite, cyclical, and above all, constructive.